In the summer of 1944, the Pacific was ablaze. Nearly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire had begun to falter in the whirlwind of a war it no longer controlled. The bloody campaigns at Guadalcanal, the defeats in the Solomon Islands, and especially the Battle of Midway in 1942 had gravely weakened the once formidable Japanese carrier fleet. Meanwhile, the immense industrial might of the United States surged like a rising tide, producing warships, aircraft, and weapons at a pace unprecedented in history. Across the Pacific fronts, the momentum was shifting steadily toward America, and all eyes turned to the Mariana Islands, a place considered the key to opening the gateway into the very heart of Japan. The Mariana chain, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, was far more than scattered specks in the ocean. For the Americans, seizing it meant building air bases close enough to launch direct B-29 raids against Tokyo and Japan's industrial centers. For the Japanese, losing it meant exposing their backyard, stripping away the strategic shield of the home islands, and accepting a terrifying reality. American bombs would soon fall on their homeland. Thus, the struggle for the Marianas was destined to become a life-or-death confrontation, one that would help decide the fate of the entire Pacific War. In this critical moment, the U.S. Navy deployed a massive force, the Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance. It was the largest concentration of heavy and light aircraft carriers ever assembled, a vivid testament to America's extraordinary industrial power. In the skies, thousands of aircraft stood ready to clash with the Japanese. Beneath the waves, American submarines, once seen as a shadowy secondary force, now played a pivotal role, scouting, intercepting, and lying in wait to deliver lethal strikes against Japan's most prized warships. One of those submarines was USS Cavalla, SS-244, a Gato-class boat. Launched in 1943 and named after a species of fish, its destiny would be tied to encounters of historic scale. Nearly 100 meters long, armed with Mark 14 torpedoes, initially plagued with reliability problems but much improved by mid-1944, Cavala was fast enough to track targets on the surface at 20 knots and stealthy enough to creep at 9 knots underwater, evading deadly escorts. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, a young but resolute officer, Cavala embodied the dual role of American submarines, not merely the eyes of the fleet, but also a sharpened sword poised to cut down enemy capital ships. With a crew of about 80 men, Kostler prepared for their first war patrol, a perilous mission into the waters of the Marianas, where a single mistake could turn the submarine into a steel coffin on the ocean floor. Meanwhile, Japan committed nearly everything it had left to one final gamble. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the mobile fleet, gathering the remnants of Japan's carrier strength. At its core was Shokaku, one of the most powerful carriers that had taken part in Pearl Harbor. Displacing over 30,000 tons and carrying more than 70 aircraft, Shokaku had long been a symbol of Imperial Navy pride. She had survived many brutal battles, yet now faced an opponent with overwhelming superiority. Japan still clung to the hope that a decisive battle might break America's advance and force Washington to negotiate. But that hope was like a dying flame in a storm. The U.S. not only had far more carriers and planes, but also the advantage of intelligence. American codebreakers, working through the JN-25 system, had unraveled Japan's plans. Long before Ozawa's ships sailed, the Americans already knew where, when, and with what force they would come. Every move Ozawa made was laid bare to his enemy. In this vast strategic drama, Cavala was but a single piece, but one that could change everything. As she left port, her crew did not know exactly what they would face. They only knew the war had reached a decisive phase, and that every torpedo they fired might alter history. In the dark depths of the Pacific, the small steel submarine pressed north of the Marianas, heading toward a destiny that would etch its name into the proud annals of U.S. submarine warfare. Life aboard Cavala was tense, yet resolute. Most of the sailors were barely in their 20s, carrying both the gnawing fear of death and the burning anger born of Pearl Harbor and years of war. Each time the boat dove, the pressure made the hull creak ominously, a constant reminder of the thin barrier separating them from the abyss. They lived in silence, for even a stray sound could bring down the wrath of Japanese escorts with their depth charges. In those long, claustrophobic hours, life and death hung by the thickness of a few inches of steel. It was discipline and cohesion that sustained them. They were not just individuals, but parts of a living war machine. The radar operator, the sonar man, the torpedo crew, the helmsman, all worked in flawless coordination. A single mistake could doom them all. They knew that survival depended on each link in the chain holding firm against the crushing weight of war. Above, the Pacific's surface swelled and churned, heralding the coming storm. American carriers surged toward the Marianas, launching waves of bombers to pound Saipan. Ozawa drove his fleet northward, seeking a decisive clash. In those tense June days of 1944, the air was thick with anticipation. And somewhere beneath the sea, the little submarine Cavala waited in silence, ready to seize its moment and carve a legend into history. June 19th, 1944. The vast Philippine Sea stretched endlessly before them, but beneath the calm blue waves lurked steel predators waiting for their moment. Among them, USS Cavalla glided silently through the deep like a shark stalking its prey. Inside the cramped hull, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and tension. The crew was used to such confinement, but today was different. They could feel something approaching. Not far away, on the surface, Japan's mobile fleet advanced. In a desperate effort to stop the Americans from seizing the Marianas, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had thrown in the last strength of Japan's carrier arm. At the heart of his force loomed the carrier Shokaku, once a source of pride, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor strike. Its vast gray flight deck had symbolized naval might, but now it was like an aging beast, still dangerous, but weary and hunted by a stronger foe. Aboard Cavala, the radar screen flickered with faint contacts. "Large signal to the northeast," the radar operator called out in the control room. All eyes turned toward Commander Herman Kostler. Calm but sharp-eyed, he recognized the moment they had awaited. They knew the Japanese fleet was near, but fate had delivered them into striking distance of one of the most valuable targets imaginable, the carrier Shokaku. Kostler ordered a reduction in speed, letting Cavala melt deeper into the shadows of the sea. He would not risk exposing their position too soon. Their mission was not reckless bravado. It was precision, waiting for the perfect chance to deliver a killing blow. In the sonar room, operators pressed their headphones tight, capturing every distant thrum, propellers churning water, faint metallic clanks. Each sound painted a picture of the vast fleet ahead, not just Shokaku, but deadly escorts prowling nearby. The tension rose with every passing minute. Move in too quickly, and they would be discovered and crushed by depth charges. Wait too long, and the opportunity of a lifetime would slip away. Kostler studied the chart, then gave quiet orders to adjust their approach. The submarine angled into position, each careful turn carrying the weight of triumph or disaster. In the torpedo room, preparations were underway. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes, over 6 meters long, each weighing nearly 1.5 tons, were ready in their tubes. Once maligned for faulty detonators and depth-keeping errors, they had since been improved, and the crew placed their faith in them. One sailor whispered, "If just 3 hit, we'll make history." No one answered, but all silently agreed. As Cavala crept closer, blurred shapes resolved through the periscope. On the surface, Shokaku loomed like a floating island, her deck crowded with planes being readied for launch. The Japanese pilots above had no idea that death stalked them from below. Kostler studied range, speed, and bearing with the steady focus of a seasoned hunter, waiting for the exact second to strike. Every moment was perilous. Escort ships bristling with sonar and depth charges patrolled nearby, ready to pounce at the first hint of intrusion. Each sweep of enemy sonar made the crew hold their breath, hearts hammering. Death hovered inches away, yet their hunger for victory steadied them. Then came the decisive moment. Through the periscope, Shokaku filled the crosshairs. The giant prey steamed forward, oblivious on the track Cavala had calculated. In the control room, Kostler gave the command, "Stand by to fire torpedoes!" The air seemed to compress. Only the ticking of the clock and the hiss of pumps broke the silence. Sweaty hands gripped firing levers, eyes fixed, nerves taut. "Fire!" Kostler ordered. With a heavy whoosh, the first torpedo sped into the sea, followed by the second, the third, until all 6 raced toward their target. 6 steel lances, 6 hopes of survival, streaked through the depths toward the legendary carrier. Inside Cavala, the crew waited in tense silence. Each second dragged like an eternity. Would the torpedoes work? Would they strike true? Then the sea erupted. A thunderous explosion sent a towering column of water skyward. A second detonation followed, then a third. Shokaku was hit. Her massive hull shuddered violently, flames bursting from ruptured fuel tanks. Fires raced across the ship, igniting stored bombs and ammunition. The once mighty carrier became a blazing inferno, black smoke rising in a choking column that blotted out the sky. Aboard Cavala, suppressed cheers burst out. The impossible had been done. Their torpedoes had struck home and a giant had fallen. But the triumph was short-lived. Japanese escorts were already reacting, their sonar picking up Cavala's trail. Depth charges were being readied, and the submarine's crew knew with grim clarity. Their greatest test was just beginning. The first explosions thundered like rolling storms in the depths of the ocean. Through his periscope, Commander Kostler saw a towering column of water erupt off Shokaku's port side, then a second, then a third. Cavala's torpedoes had struck home. The massive carrier shuddered violently, the sound of tearing metal echoing across the sea. With each impact, her hull split further apart, flames and smoke engulfing the flight deck. On Shokaku, chaos reigned instantly. Sailors had no time to comprehend before the entire ship convulsed. Pilots readying for takeoff were hurled across the deck. Several fully fueled, armed planes exploded in fireballs, flames racing into fuel stores and bomb magazines below deck. Secondary blasts ripped through the ship in a deadly chain reaction. In moments, Shokaku became a fireball. Heat so intense melted paint into streams. Shouts, alarm bells, and officers screaming firefighting orders blended into a cacophony of destruction. Brave sailors dragged hoses across the deck, only for them to be disabled by the blast pressure of burning gas. Some men were blown overboard, vanishing into the sea. Below, the engine rooms became death traps. As torpedoes tore open the hull, seawater surged in, drowning hundreds in darkness. Those who escaped the flooding were trapped by fires above. With no escape, many collapsed in the choking smoke. Once a proud jewel of the Imperial Navy, Shokaku now writhed like a mortally wounded beast. Each new detonation ripped away more steel, flames consuming what remained. On the flight deck, rows of planes waiting for launch became bombs in their own right. As fire touched them, they detonated, hurling propellers, engines, and wreckage skyward before raining debris into the sea. Aboard Cavala, the crew watched through the periscope. Some gasped or cheered, but most sat in stunned silence at the carnage. They knew they had sunk one of Japan's mightiest carriers, but also recognized the cost of war. Thousands of men dying in agony because of distant orders. Kostler kept his face hard, refusing emotion. He ordered a course change, bracing for the inevitable counterattack. On Shokaku, Captain Matsubara Hiroshi struggled to impose order. He ordered evacuation, but the situation was hopeless. The flight deck was destroyed, stairwells clogged with fire and smoke. Many sailors leapt into the sea, Others stayed aboard, desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. But fate was sealed. Half an hour after impact, a catastrophic blast tore through the ammunition magazines. The ship's frame convulsed, the flight deck split apart, and flames soared skyward, lighting the midday sky. The ship listed hard, seawater pouring in unchecked. The carrier's final minutes were a nightmare. Screeching metal marked her collapse. Sailors cried out in desperation. Some officers, knowing survival was impossible, chose to go down with her. As the bow slipped beneath the waves, the rising sun flag still flew at the mast, a tragic symbol of a fading empire. At noon, Shokaku vanished beneath the sea, taking over 200 sailors and airmen with her. Only a few hundred were rescued by escorts. For the survivors, the grief of losing comrades and the pride of their navy sank with the ship. Inside Cavala, silence lingered. Costler knew he had made history, sending to the bottom one of the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, yet he forbade celebration. Instead, he ordered the crew to brace for the storm. The Japanese had detected the torpedo launch, and now destroyers closed in with sonar and depth charges. Within minutes, the sea above boiled with vengeance. The sonar picked up destroyer screws racing in, followed by the thunder of depth charges. Explosions battered the submarine, her hull rattling violently. Sailors clung to rails as steel groaned under the assault. Fear pressed down like the ocean itself, but no one abandoned his post. They knew survival demanded endurance through the hours of relentless depth charging that lay ahead. Cavala had struck the fatal blow, but the true fight for survival had only just begun. The moment Shokaku slipped beneath the waves, Cavala became the #1 target of the Japanese fleet. Escort ships quickly pinpointed the submarine's firing position and charged in like hunting wolves. Inside Cavala's control room, the dim red lights cast tense shadows across the crew's faces. No one spoke. Only the sonar's steady ping, ping, echoed, each beat sharper, warning that the enemy was closing in. "Take her deeper," Costler ordered, his voice firm but edged with strain. Cavala began its descent. 50 meters, 70, 100. The depth gauge needle shook violently as seawater pressed harder against the steel hull. The crew could hear the submarine groaning under the massive pressure. Then, the first explosion ripped through the silence. A thunderous roar reverberated across the hull, water inside sloshing, light fixtures swaying. That was the first depth charge, just the beginning. For the next 3 hours, more than 100 depth charges were unleashed. The sound of destroyer propellers thrummed above, followed by rapid sonar pings. Then came the most dreadful silence, seconds of waiting for death, before the ocean erupted again. Boom! 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 Shock waves hammered the submarine, pipes rattled, bolts popped loose, welds cracked, and water seeped in through ruptured seams. The air grew thick with the stench of oil, hot steel, and sweat. Men held their breath, ears straining to hear if the hull would withstand another barrage. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their jaws, hands gripping air pipes. Not a sound could escape them. One stray noise might betray Cavala's position. Costler sat rigid, eyes locked on the sonar and depth gauge. He knew the deadly balance. Too deep, and the hull would be crushed. Too shallow, and the submarine would be torn apart by depth charges. It was a knife-edge game of survival. One wrong move, meaning the death of all 89 men aboard. Outside, the sea convulsed as depth charges rained down, exploding into towering water plumes. The thunder rolled beneath the ocean, bursting eardrums, drawing blood from eyes and noses. Gauges shattered. In the engine room, pipes rattled violently, steam hissing out. Engineers scrambled to patch leaks with rags and tape, fully aware that one major rupture would doom them all. Time dragged on unbearably. Each minute stretched into an hour, each volley of depth charges sliced into their nerves like a blade. After more than an hour, some sailors began to crack, hands trembling, eyes wide in panic, whispers of, "We're all going to die." But discipline held them together. They looked to Captain Costler, still calm, issuing crisp commands, and clung to his composure like a lifeline. At one point, a charge detonated so close the entire submarine convulsed, as if being torn apart. Lights flickered, some going out. Water gushed into a compartment. "Flooding!" came the cry. Sailors rushed to seal hatches and pump out seawater. Sweat and spray fell like rain in the darkness, but no one abandoned their post. Above, Japanese destroyers circled relentlessly. They were certain Cavala was trapped beneath their keels. Volley after volley of charges pounded the depths, tearing apart the sea where Shokaku had gone down. For 3 hours, the ocean itself seemed to be boiling. Inside Cavala, oxygen and fuel dwindled. Air grew suffocating, CO2 thickening with every breath. Some men collapsed from lack of oxygen. Others had to use emergency breathing tubes. But the blowers could not run at full power. Too much noise and sonar would find them instantly. Each breath became a battle for life. At last, after more than 3 hours, the explosions began to fade. Japanese destroyers, convinced the submarine had been crushed, shifted course to hunt elsewhere. Silence fell again inside Cavala. But it was not peaceful silence. It was the silence of exhaustion, of men who realized they had somehow survived the unendurable. Costler finally exhaled, allowing himself a moment of release. He looked around, his crew pale, drenched in sweat and oil, their faces drawn with fatigue. Yet in their eyes burned a fierce light. They had slain a giant and lived to tell the tale. On the surface, wreckage from Shokaku drifted among oil slicks and charred aircraft debris. Japanese ships still reeled in shock from the loss of one of their proudest carriers. None of them knew that deep below, Cavala, the silent sea wolf, was slipping away into the dark, carrying with her a victory that would alter the course of the Pacific War. When the final explosion faded, Cavala lay motionless in the darkness of the ocean floor. The crew held their breath and listened. No more destroyer propellers, no more sonar pings. Only the faint groan of strained steel and the pounding of hearts inside chests. They had survived. After more than 3 hours of relentless depth charging, the submarine remained intact, battered, flooded in a few compartments, but not crushed. Costler ordered silence for a while longer. He knew too well that the enemy sometimes pretended to leave, hoping to lure their prey to the surface. Only when sonar stayed completely silent did he allow Cavala to inch away from the killing ground. In the control room, sailors' eyes gleamed with an indescribable faith. They exchanged glances without a word, but deep down, all understood. They had just walked the razor's edge between life and death. A few quietly wiped away tears, not from fear, but from sheer relief. Cavala slipped southward, cloaked beneath the deep waves. Progress was slow, meter by meter, to avoid making noise. The men were exhausted, yet none allowed themselves to collapse. Their duty was not done. They still had to bring the submarine home safely, carrying news of victory to the fleet. For the next several hours, Cavala moved like a ghost. No lights, no loud voices. Engines ran at the barest minimum. In the suffocating air, many sailors leaned against steel walls, eyes shut, heads drooping, hands still gripping their tools. They drifted into uneasy sleep, haunted by nightmares of depth charges, the echoes of explosions still ringing as if they had never stopped. Once they cleared the danger zone, Costler ordered the submarine to surface for fresh air. The open sky poured into the hull like a blessing. Men inhaled deeply, some lifting their faces to the starlit heavens and whispering thanks. The Pacific night was clear, a crescent moon casting pale light over the waves. Far off, oil slicks shimmered faintly, the last traces of Shokaku's wreckage, proof that they had accomplished the impossible. But joy was fleeting. Cavala resumed her cautious journey back to base. The Japanese fleet was still thick in the region. A single mistake could mean discovery and destruction. In the days that followed, life aboard Cavala stayed taut as a drawn wire. Men rotated shifts at sonar, radar, and lookout. Each unusual signal made hearts seize. More than once, the shadow of a Japanese ship appeared on the horizon, forcing Cavala to dive swiftly and evade. The constant strain robbed sailors of sleep and appetite, yet no one complained. They had come too far to falter now. On the 5th day after the attack, Cavala finally managed to contact the U.S. fleet through a secure radio channel. When the message came, reporting the sinking of Shokaku, one of Japan's main carriers from Pearl Harbor, headquarters at first doubted the claim, but reconnaissance planes soon confirmed the oil slicks and massive debris fields. Excitement erupted. "You've made history!" came the command reply, crackling through the speakers. Cavala's compartments burst into cheers, the first in many tense days. Some sailors embraced, others pounded the steel walls in release. Costler kept his calm expression, yet pride shone in his eyes. He knew this victory came not just from torpedoes, but from the steel resolve of every man who endured the storm of depth charges. When Cavala entered Pearl Harbor, a sight unlike any other awaited. Dozens of ships sounded their horns in salute, flags waving high. Sailors lined the decks, clapping and cheering as Cavala glided into the bay. Word of her triumph had already spread. The small sea wolf had brought down one of Japan's greatest beasts. On shore, senior officers greeted them with ceremony. Costler received medals, and the crew was honored. Yet, behind the applause and banners, the truth of war remained clear. They had survived, but thousands of others had perished in the inferno. The memory of depth charges would haunt them forever. Many nights later, Cavala's men still woke to phantom explosions, still jolted from sleep by the feeling of the hull shuddering. Some grew quiet, withdrawn. They had returned with glory, but also with invisible scars. As for Costler, in his final report he wrote not only the battle's details, but also a single solemn line. "We have fulfilled our duty, but let it be remembered that beneath those waves more than 1,000 men remain forever." It was a reminder that war, no matter the victory, is always a tragedy. News of Shokaku's sinking spread rapidly across the Pacific, then crossed the ocean to Washington and Tokyo. For the United States, it was a victory of immense significance. Shokaku was not just a heavy carrier, but a living symbol of Japan's naval might. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, it had repeatedly struck fear into Allied fleets. Now that giant had been sent to the bottom by a single submarine, undeniable proof that the balance of power in the Pacific was tipping decisively toward America. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of Shokaku was a devastating blow, both strategically and psychologically. Since Midway, they had already lost many fleet carriers, and with each one sunk, their ability to control the skies diminished further. When Shokaku went down, her veteran air crews perished with her, and they could not be replaced. Japan no longer had the time, fuel, or training resources to forge a new generation of pilots. The Pacific skies, once marked by the rising sun, were now increasingly dominated by the white stars painted on American wings. For Cavala, the victory became one of the brightest chapters in U.S. submarine history. In official reports, the fleet praised her as the sea wolf that tore out the enemy's heart. Her crew received high decorations, and the name Cavala was etched onto the list of the war's most illustrious submarines. Yet after the applause faded, life went on. Cavala was not granted long rest. She returned to patrols, tightening the noose around Japan's shipping lanes. Not every mission yielded a triumph as dramatic as the destruction of Shokaku, but the name Cavala became a lurking terror in the minds of Japanese captains, a reminder of the unseen dangers beneath the sea. When the war ended in August 1945, Cavala and her crew came home to the joy of peace. Many of the young sailors, who had survived the hell of depth charges and near-death moments, returned to ordinary life, starting families and careers. But in their minds, the memory of June 19, 1944, the day they sank Shokaku, and the suffocating hours under a rain of depth charges never faded. Shokaku herself remained on the seafloor, more than 1,000 meters deep, becoming the massive grave of over 1,200 Japanese sailors. For many in Japan after the war, Shokaku was not merely a lost warship, but a symbol of the sacrifice of an entire generation. Today, when deep-sea explorers locate her wreck, they still find the broken mast, the shattered flight deck, yet faint traces of the rising sun painted on rusted steel linger, a somber reminder of the past. The Cavala-Shokaku encounter left another legacy. It proved that in modern warfare, the submarine was no longer a secondary weapon, but a decisive blade. A small vessel, armed with just a handful of torpedoes, could destroy a massive engine of war. From that moment on, naval strategy changed forever. No fleet could afford to underestimate the threat lurking beneath the waves. After the war, USS Cavalla was preserved as part of history. She was brought to Galveston, Texas, and turned into a museum ship open to the public. Visitors can see the cramped compartments, the old torpedo rooms and control panels, and hear the story of that fateful day in the Philippine Sea. Many Cavala veterans, while still alive, returned to her, standing silently for hours in the control room, where they had endured the nightmare of 3 hours of depth charging. In Japan, the memory of Shokaku is honored with solemn respect for the sailors who never returned. In memorial services, their courage and discipline are remembered, even though the war itself has long ended. Later generations look upon that sacrifice as a reminder that war brings nothing but loss, and that peace is far more precious than any martial glory. Looking back, the battle between Cavala and Shokaku was more than a tactical clash. It was a symbol. It revealed the difference in strategy, technology, and mindset between the two sides. On one hand, Imperial Japan, convinced that giant carriers and kamikaze spirit would decide the war. On the other, the United States, relying on technology, industrial production, and undersea warfare. The outcome is now part of history. That legacy endures in books, films, and museums. It reminds us that war, however brutal, leaves behind priceless lessons. From the courage of Cavala's crew to the tragic sacrifice of Shokaku's men, together they form an unforgettable chapter of the 20th century. Today, when visitors walk the decks of Cavala in Texas, they see more than a cold iron vessel. They see a story of resilience, of young men daring to face death. And as they gaze out over the vast ocean, they may imagine Shokaku still resting beneath the waves, a silent tomb that whispers to humanity, "Never let war happen again." The greatest legacy of that battle is not victory or defeat, but the clear truth that in war, the victors also suffer losses, and the vanquished leave behind a legacy. Cavala and Shokaku, though their fates diverged, now both stand as witnesses of history, reminding mankind of the value of peace, the terrible cost of conflict, and the courage of those who lived and died upon the sea.